Before we dive into today's mystery, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep uncovering the unknown. Now, let's begin. Princeton, New Jersey, is known for its quiet affluence, elite academia, and well-manicured lawns stretching as far as the eye can see. The Hertgen family fits seamlessly into this picture, a well-respected, seemingly perfect household where success was an expectation, not a hope. David Hertgen Sr. was a successful businessman, the type of man who commanded respect in any boardroom he entered. His wife, an elegant yet reserved woman, had dedicated her life to raising their 3 sons, David Jr., Matthew, and Joseph, instilling in them the values of discipline, ambition, and self-reliance. Among them, Joseph Hertgen shined the brightest. The 26-year-old former soccer star at the University of Michigan had an impressive resume, sharp-minded, ambitious, and already working as a financial analyst. Handsome and well-liked, Joseph was someone people gravitated toward, the kind of man his younger brother Matthew had spent a lifetime living in the shadow of. Matthew, 31, had always been different. Though he had once been an athlete like his brothers, something had changed in the last 5 years. His promising future had begun to slip through his fingers as mental instability took hold. By 2025, he was barely a shadow of the man he used to be. His decline wasn't sudden. It had been creeping in, whispered about at family gatherings, dismissed as a rough patch by those who didn't want to admit that something was terribly, terribly wrong. But by the time the Hertgen family would finally acknowledge it, it would be too late. Matthew's mind had become a battlefield of torment. He spoke in fragmented sentences, often referencing visions no one else could see. He was convinced he was being watched, stalked by unseen forces. He wrote disturbing poetry and posted eerie photographs on social media, hinting at something dark lurking within him. But even those closest to him couldn't fully comprehend just how dangerous he had become. His paranoia deepened. He spoke of a darkness that was trying to consume him. He's not himself. David Jr. had confided in a close friend weeks before the tragedy. I don't know what's happening to him. What made it all the more disturbing was the silence from their parents. Despite the signs, despite Matthew's erratic behavior, no intervention had taken place. There were no forced psychiatric evaluations, no desperate attempts to seek help. Perhaps they believed it would pass. Perhaps they feared the stain it would leave on the family's name. But Joseph, steady, strong, reliable Joseph, wasn't one to abandon family, no matter how difficult things became. He had always been the one to protect Matthew, and in the final days before his death, he was trying to do just that. February 22nd, 2025, started like any other day. David Jr. had spent hours with Matthew, keeping an eye on him. That evening, he had taken his unstable younger brother out for groceries, trying to give him some sense of normalcy. Matthew had seemed distant, lost in thought, but there was no immediate sign of danger. At around 10 p.m., David Jr. dropped Matthew back off his residence, where Joseph was waiting. "Keep an eye on him," David Jr. texted his younger brother. "Will do," Joseph replied. That was the last message he would ever send. Just 45 minutes later, David Jr. sent another text to Matthew, inviting him for a hike the next morning. "Hang in there, man," he wrote, as if trying to hold his brother back on the edge of whatever abyss he was teetering over. But the abyss had already swallowed Matthew whole. At 11:16 p.m., a chilling 911 call was placed. "There's a fire," Matthew said, his voice eerily calm, "and my brother is dead." When officers arrived, they were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The apartment smelled of burned flesh. Blood pooled on the floor, smeared across the walls. The body of Joseph Hertgen lay lifeless, his once athletic form now broken, mutilated by an unrelenting storm of violence. A golf club, its shaft bent from repeated use, lay discarded nearby. A knife, slick with crimson, glistened under the artificial light. The room bore the signs of a struggle, a desperate fight for life against someone who had been family only moments before. In the corner of the apartment, they found another horror. A cat, partially burned, lay atop an ottoman. The fire, Matthew had said, hadn't just been an attempt to destroy evidence. It had been ritualistic, a final descent into complete madness. And yet, When the officers looked at Matthew, standing there in his blood-stained clothes, his face was blank, not remorseful, not regretful, empty. Matthew Hertgen was taken into custody that night, charged with first-degree murder, weapons possession, and animal cruelty. During his court appearance, there were two notable absences: his parents, the very people who had raised these brothers, who had crafted the illusion of a perfect family, were nowhere to be seen. Joseph's funeral was held at St. Luke Roman Catholic Church in Toms River. Nearly 100 mourners gathered, many still unable to comprehend how such a tragedy had unfolded. David Jr. delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke of his lost brother. Joseph was a friend to all, he said, his words heavy with grief. But there was another unspoken truth in that church, a realization that, perhaps, they had all seen the signs too late. Perhaps the tragedy of the Hertgen family wasn't just that Joseph had died. Perhaps the real tragedy was that, in a town full of perfect families, no one had wanted to admit that the Hertgens had been falling apart all along. The phone rang at exactly 11:16 p.m. on February 22nd, 2025. The Mercer County 911 operator answered, expecting to hear the usual: a car accident, a noise complaint, perhaps a domestic dispute. But what came through the receiver was something far worse. "There's a fire," the man on the other end said. His voice was strangely even, devoid of panic. "And my brother is dead." The operator stiffened. "Sir, what do you mean your brother is dead?" "He's dead. I killed him." A pause. "I don't know what happened." The operator tried to steady their breathing. They had taken many distress calls before, but this was different. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" A long silence. Then, finally, the voice responded. "Matthew Hertgen." The call lasted exactly 1 minute and 42 seconds. And by the time the dispatcher alerted the Princeton Police Department, a horror unlike anything the small, affluent town had ever seen was about to be uncovered. When the first officers arrived at the scene, it was impossible to ignore the acrid stench of burning flesh. The air inside the apartment was thick with smoke, but the fire had already begun to die down. The charred remains of an ottoman smoldered in the living room. And then there was the body. Joseph Hertgen, 26 years old, lay sprawled on the floor in an unnatural position, his limbs twisted as if he had fought until the very last moment. His head was a ruin. Blunt force trauma had caved in his skull. The floor around him slick with blood. His throat had been cut. Nearby, the weapons used in the attack lay discarded. A golf club, its metal head bent from repeated use. A knife, its handle sticky with blood. But that wasn't all. In the corner of the room, a cat, partially burned, was perched on the smoldering ottoman. It had not been an accident. Matthew had placed it there deliberately, as if in some kind of twisted ritual. And then there was Matthew himself. He was waiting for them, standing in the middle of the chaos he had created, his clothes drenched in blood, his face blank. There was no struggle when the officers ordered him to the ground, no resistance when they placed him in handcuffs, just silence. By the time Matthew Hertgen was brought into custody, the Princeton Police Department had already begun piecing together the timeline. Surveillance footage from the local grocery store showed Matthew shopping with David Jr. just hours before the attack. His demeanor was calm. Nothing seemed out of place. His text messages, however, told a different story. At 10 p.m., David Jr. had dropped Matthew off at the apartment. At 10:30 p.m., David Jr. had sent Joseph a warning text. "Keep an eye on him." At 11 p.m., Joseph had responded, "Will do." At 11:16 p.m., Matthew had dialed 911. The attack had occurred within that 45-minute window, and it had been brutal. Crime scene analysts determined that Joseph had fought back. His arms bore defensive wounds, his knuckles bruised from striking Matthew in a desperate attempt to save himself. But Matthew had been relentless. The golf club had been the first weapon. The repeated blows had left Joseph disoriented, but he had still been alive when Matthew grabbed the knife. The throat wound was what had killed him. And then there was the fire. Investigators determined that Matthew had set fire to the ottoman after the murder. Whether it was an attempt to destroy evidence or something more sinister was unclear. But one thing was certain. He had waited in that apartment, surrounded by death, until he made that eerie, measured 911 call. At the Princeton Police Department, Matthew Hertgen sat in the interrogation room, still wearing his blood-soaked clothes. Detective Michael Rogers, a seasoned investigator, had seen a lot in his career, but there was something different about this case. Something unsettling about the way Matthew sat there, staring at the wall, unblinking. "Matthew," the detective started, "can you tell me what happened tonight?" For a long time, there was no answer. Then, in a whisper, Matthew spoke. "I don't know." Detective Rogers leaned in. "You don't know?" Matthew's gaze flickered. It was like, "I wasn't there," like something else took over. Rogers studied him. It wasn't uncommon for killers to claim memory loss, but there was something chilling about the way Matthew said it, like he truly believed it. "You killed your brother," Rogers pressed. "You called 911. You told us yourself." Matthew's lips parted slightly, as if he had just realized something. "I did, didn't I?" And then, just like that, he went silent again. As investigators combed through the apartment, they found something strange. A plate, smeared with blood, sat neatly on the kitchen counter. Beside it, a cup also stained red. It looked as if someone had prepared a meal, but the blood wasn't Joseph's. It was Matthew's. Had he cut himself and then consumed his own blood? Or had he staged the scene for some unknown reason? Forensic experts couldn't determine an answer. The only person who knew the truth was Matthew, and he wasn't talking. 2 days after his arrest, Matthew Hertgen sat in a stark white room at the Mercer County Correctional Facility, his wrists shackled, his expression vacant. Across from him, Dr. Emily Rosen, a forensic psychiatrist, studied his every move. "Do you know why you're here, Matthew?" she asked, keeping her tone measured. Matthew's lips twitched. He blinked, slowly, as if the question had pulled him out of a daze. "My brother is dead," he murmured. "Do you remember what happened that night?" A long silence stretched between them. Then Matthew's head tilted slightly. "There was a voice," he said. "It told me to do it." Dr. Rosen made a note. Paranoid delusions, possible schizophrenia. Matthew's defense attorneys, led by Michael Sweeney, had already made their position clear. They were preparing to enter an insanity plea, arguing that Matthew had been in the throes of psychotic break when he murdered his brother. The prosecution, however, wasn't convinced. This wasn't a man in a psychotic episode. Assistant Prosecutor Rachel Whitman declared in a press statement, "This was a brutal, premeditated act of violence." If the court accepted the insanity plea, Matthew would be committed to a psychiatric institution instead of spending life in prison. If they rejected it, he would be locked away in a maximum security prison for the rest of his life. The battle lines had been drawn. Matthew's first court appearance on February 27, 2025, was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and shell-shocked Princeton residents. The Hertgen family was notably absent. His older brother, David Hertgen Jr., sat alone in the second row, staring at the man who had murdered his younger sibling. When the judge asked Matthew how he pleaded, his voice was barely a whisper. "Not guilty by reason of insanity." Murmurs erupted throughout the courtroom. The insanity plea was controversial. The prosecution was pushing for first-degree murder and life without parole, while the defense insisted that Matthew had lost touch with reality. But one thing couldn't be ignored: Matthew's eerie calm. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't crying, a court reporter later recounted. It was like he wasn't there at all. The judge denied bail. Matthew would remain in custody until the trial. And as reporters rushed to capture every detail of the case, one question haunted everyone. Had the Hertgen family ignored the warning signs? While David Jr. made public statements about Joseph's death, the Hertgen parents refused to speak. They did not attend the court hearings. They did not release a statement. They did not even attend Joseph's funeral. The silence was deafening. David Jr. was left to pick up the pieces alone. At Joseph's funeral at St. Luke Roman Catholic Church, he stood at the podium, his voice breaking. "My brother was my best friend," he said, "and I should have done more to protect him." Tears fell from the faces of Joseph's former classmates, teammates, and friends. Many quietly wondered why Matthew had not been committed to a psychiatric facility long before that night. A family with wealth and influence had the resources to intervene, but they hadn't, and now one son was dead and the other was a killer. The Hertgen case devoured the news cycle. Major outlets like CNN, NBC, and the New York Times ran stories about the perfect Princeton family that had been hiding a deadly secret. Neighbors came forward, revealing that Matthew had been showing erratic behavior for years. He spoke to himself in public. He believed he was being watched. He had posted cryptic messages online, referencing a darkness inside him. Princeton residents were horrified. How did no one do anything? One woman asked a reporter. A former teacher, Matthews, recalled seeing him in 2019, looking disheveled and vacant. He told me he was being followed, she said. I thought he was joking. But no one had acted. And now Joseph Hertgen was dead. As prosecutors built their case, forensic evidence painted a chilling picture of Joseph's final moments. Blood spatter patterns suggested Joseph had been attacked while sitting on the couch. The angle of the golf club strike showed rage, not a moment of insanity. Matthew had made no attempt to flee. Instead, he sat in the apartment for 45 minutes before calmly calling 911. The prosecution's expert witness, Dr. Alan Barker, made a damning statement in court. This was not a break from reality. This was a cold, calculated killing. The defense, however, argued otherwise. Dr. Emily Rosen, who had evaluated Matthew, took the stand. He was severely mentally ill, she insisted. He believed something had taken control of him. But the jury wasn't convinced, and as the trial neared its end, Matthew Hertgen's fate hung in the balance. 1 week had passed since Joseph Hertgen's brutal murder. The case had dominated news headlines, and Princeton, once a quiet, prestigious town, was now the center of a tragedy no one could ignore. The funeral had taken place 2 days ago, on March 7th. The turnout was massive. Friends, teachers, neighbors, even strangers who had never met Joseph came to pay their respects. But there were 2 people missing. David and Linda Hertgen, Joseph's own parents, never showed up. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said they had left town, too ashamed to face the community. Others believed they were in hiding, refusing to acknowledge the truth. A few even claimed they were secretly supporting Matthew, despite everything. Whatever the case, they were gone, and the town would never forgive them.